Imagine dedicating your life to caring for someone, loving, protecting, and doing everything in your power for them, only to, one day, be betrayed in the worst way possible. Now, try to imagine losing 17 years of your life, locked behind bars, accused of a crime you never committed, all because of a cruel lie. A lie told by someone you would never suspect. A lie that destroyed your reputation, separated you from your family, and turned every second of your existence into a true nightmare. This story is about broken trust, failed justice, and a woman who was wrongfully condemned by her own niece. How did this happen? What led this young woman to accuse someone who was always by her side? What did the courts do to convict a person without concrete evidence? And the most revolting, how did the truth come to light after so many years? This story is so unbelievable that it seems like something out of a movie, but it's not. And the worst? This is not an isolated case. Situations like this happen all the time, and at any time, anyone can become the next victim of a false accusation. The justice system, which should protect the innocent, often works in a cruel and merciless way. It's not enough to be innocent, you have to prove it. But how can you prove that you didn't commit a crime when all the evidence has been manipulated? How to fight against a system that, many times, has already decided your destiny before the trial even begins. This story will leave you outraged. It will make you question everything you know about justice, and more than that, it will make you realize how fragile the line between freedom and prison is. But before continuing, tell me, do you believe that the justice system always gets it right? Or do you think there are many innocent people paying for other people's mistakes? Comment below, justice or injustice, because this story deserves to be discussed. And now, brace yourself, because what happened next is even more revolting. If this story has already outraged you so far, get ready, because what comes next is even more unbelievable. With each detail revealed, it becomes clearer how the system can fail in a cruel and irreversible way. And what's worse, this continues to happen. If you believe that these stories cannot be forgotten, leave your like now so that more people know this truth. And if you want to follow the most shocking cases of miscarriages of justice, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because believe me, this will not be the last time an innocent person pays for someone else's crime. Elizabeth Ramirez never imagined her life could change so drastically in a matter of days. In 1994, at just 20 years old, she was a young woman full of dreams, living in Texas and trying to build a worthy future. But one mistake, a simple no, said to the wrong person, was enough to ruin his existence. Her former brother-in-law, Javier Limon, harbored a dark obsession with her, something Elizabeth always rejected. He was insistent, controlling, and did everything he could to get closer. But when he realized he would never get what he wanted, rejection turned into hatred. And it was this hatred that started the worst nightmare of her life. A few days after yet another of her refusals, Elizabeth received news that left her devastated. Her own niece, a girl just 7 years old, had accused her of something unimaginable. According to the child, Elizabeth and 3 other friends had committed a terrible act against her. The accusation fell like a bombshell, and without hesitation, without proof, without any questioning, the police immediately treated her as guilty. What was supposed to be a thorough investigation turned into a relentless manhunt. No matter the absence of physical evidence, no matter that Elizabeth had never demonstrated any suspicious behavior, what mattered was that a child had spoken. And for the system, a child's word was more than enough to condemn without looking back. Sensationalist media embraced the story with fervor. Headlines called Elizabeth and her friends monsters, spreading the narrative of a heinous crime. Public opinion already had its verdict before the trial even began. The truth no longer mattered. All that mattered was providing a face to the collective fury. But the most revolting detail of this entire accusation, Javier Limon The rejected man was behind everything. He manipulated his daughter, induced her testimony, and ensured that Elizabeth paid for the crime he invented. A cold, calculated act driven by the sick desire for revenge. Imagine being in her shoes. Imagine being betrayed by someone in your own family, someone you should protect, not destroy. Now tell me, what would you do if from one day to the next, your entire life was reduced to a lie? The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was heavy, tense, as if Elizabeth and her friends were already sentenced before the judge even opened his mouth. The trial wasn't just about them. It was a public spectacle, fueled by a collective hysteria that swept the United States in the 1990s. At that time, fear of so-called satanic sects was on the rise, and any accusation involving children was treated as an irrefutable fact, with no room for questioning. Society wanted culprits, and Elizabeth and her friends were the perfect targets. There was no physical evidence, no medical examination to indicate any type of violence, no testimony other than the word of a manipulated child. Still, to the jury and the prosecution, it didn't matter. They were determined to make an example of them, to use the case as a warning that the system protected children at all costs, even if the cost was the lives of 4 innocent women. The prosecution built its narrative on fear and indignation. They presented absurd theories, insinuating that Elizabeth and her friends were part of some cult, that they had committed heinous acts in a dark ritual. The defense, no matter how hard it tried, was unable to combat a fantasy fueled by public opinion. Every argument in favor of their innocence was ignored, drowned out by collective hatred. When the sentence was announced, time seemed to stop. Elizabeth heard the words, but her body refused to process. 37 years old, 37 years for a crime that never happened, 37 years ripped from his life, based solely on a well-told lie. The shock was immediate. Some people in the audience cheered, pleased to see justice being served. Others cried, unhappy with the cruel fate that these women were about to face. Elizabeth looked at her friends. They were all paralyzed, their eyes filled with tears and disbelief. At that point, it no longer mattered what was real and what was a fabrication. The court didn't want the truth, it wanted closure. And they would be that outcome. Handcuffed, they were removed one by one, taken away from everything they knew. And so the real nightmare began. Imagine looking into the future and seeing nothing but cold walls and iron bars. Imagine knowing that everything was a hoax and yet the whole world believed it. How to find the strength to continue? How can we endure injustice day after day without losing hope? Now tell me, what scares you more? Knowing that Elizabeth was convicted without proof, or realizing that this could happen to anyone? The system failed brutally, turned its back on the truth, and destroyed a life without hesitation. But how many other stories like this are still buried in silence? How many innocent people pay for crimes they never committed? Write in the comments, "Injustice is not justice," and help show the world that mistakes like these cannot be forgotten. The days dragged by as if time had stopped. The cold prison walls were more than concrete. They were a sentence of oblivion. Elizabeth, along with her doomed friends, faced not only the weight of unthinkable injustice, but also the daily torment of being treated like a monster. Guards and inmates looked at her with contempt, whispering insults, giving her hateful looks. To them, Elizabeth was guilty, and nothing they said would change that. There was no escaping that label. Being accused of a crime against a child made her the perfect target for humiliation and threats. Some inmates isolated her completely, while others made a point of making her life hell, spitting in her food, vandalizing her belongings, and even leaving death threat notes on her bed. But nothing hurt more than being rejected by your own family. In her early years, Elizabeth still believed that at some point, those who loved her would realize their mistake. Every week I waited for a letter, a phone call, a visit, but all he got was silence. To her family, she was a monster. Her niece, The girl she watched grow up, gave her affection and protection, accused her without hesitation. How could there be hope after this? Despair consumed her on the hardest days, and the thought that she would spend the rest of her life there, paying for something she never did, brought her to the brink of collapse. But there was something inside her that never broke, a fire, a spark of resistance. If the world wanted to forget her, she wouldn't let that happen. Elizabeth began writing letters to lawyers, human rights organizations, anyone who might hear her story. The system buried her, but she refused to disappear. She studied her case obsessively, memorized every detail, every flaw in judgment. Over time, she began to learn about how wrongful convictions worked and realized she was not alone. The system that destroyed her had already done the same to so many others. But would anyone listen to her? For years, his letters came back unanswered. For years, their requests were ignored. But then one day, something changed. A single card, which was not discarded. A single person who decided to look at the case carefully. And it was from there that the truth began to emerge. It was a day like any other, but for Elizabeth, that moment would change everything. After 17 years in prison, being treated like a monster for a crime she never committed, the truth finally began to emerge. On the other side of the country, her niece, the same one who, as a child, unfairly accused her, now an adult, carried a weight that became unbearable. For years, she lived with the guilt, knowing her words destroyed lives. He knew he had sentenced his own aunt to prison, and the truth she had kept silent for so long began to suffocate her, until one day she couldn't take it anymore. In an emotional interview, she confessed everything. She said that as a child, she was manipulated by her own father, Javier Limon, into believing a lie that he himself created. She said he convinced her that Elizabeth was dangerous, that she needed to repeat those accusations or something worse would happen. He was a child, without understanding the consequences of what he was doing. But now, as an adult, she knew she could no longer carry that burden. With tears in his eyes, he revealed that the story was never real. Elizabeth never hurt her. None of those women were guilty. It was all a cruel plan motivated by an obsessed man's desire for revenge. This confession came as a shock to everyone who followed the case. For years, the court ignored requests for review, refusing to admit any error. But now, with the victim denying the entire accusation, there were no more excuses for keeping Elizabeth and her friends imprisoned. That's when the Innocence Project joined the fight. The organization, which had previously freed dozens of the wrongfully convicted, began working tirelessly to expose the grotesque error that destroyed these 4 lives. The battle was not easy. Even with the niece's confession, the system was reluctant to admit that it had made a mistake. But the truth could no longer be buried. The defense gathered every error from the original trial, every detail ignored, every piece of evidence that was unfairly discarded. And for the first time in 17 years, Elizabeth felt there was a real chance for freedom. The question now was, how much longer would it take the system to correct the error that cost 4 innocent women nearly 2 decades of their lives? Elizabeth lost 17 years for a lie, but how many other people are still paying for crimes they never committed? The system should protect the innocent, but it often does exactly the opposite. This story cannot be forgotten. Comment your opinion here, because talking about it is the first step to preventing this injustice from happening again. When Elizabeth finally walked out of that prison door, the world seemed both familiar and unrecognizable. 17 years ago, she entered that place as a young girl full of dreams. But now, as she stepped into freedom again, it was as if she were on an unknown planet. The air felt different, the sounds seemed louder, and the streets that had once been her home no longer recognized her. Time didn't wait for her. Her youth was stolen, her reputation was destroyed, and the justice system that failed her so much didn't even offer an apology. Alongside her friends who had also been freed, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and anger. The media covered their release as if it were a great triumph for the system, but the truth is that nothing could give back the years they lost. There was no financial compensation, there was no real reparation, just the harsh reality of starting over from scratch in a world that had treated them as guilty until that moment. And perhaps the cruelest part was this: even with the truth exposed, there were still those who doubted it. There were still suspicious looks. There were still scars that would never disappear. But Elizabeth knew she couldn't stop there. She had spent years fighting to prove her innocence, and now her battle was different, ensuring that no one else would go through what she did. The case of the San Antonio 4 has become one of the most striking examples of miscarriage of justice in the United States, raising debates about unfair convictions, witness tampering, and bias in the justice system. But did the system really learn from this mistake? Or are there still other Elizabeths wasting years of their lives behind bars for crimes they never committed? Elizabeth spent years behind bars, carrying a burden that should never have been hers. All this time, her story has been distorted, her voice has been silenced, and her freedom has been mercilessly stripped away. But even in the face of pain, abandonment, and injustice, she never gave up fighting. She believed that the truth, however buried, would one day come to light, and it came. But the truth alone was not enough to repair the damage. Lost time could never be recovered. The sleepless nights, the days of despair, the longing for family, the looks of contempt, the shame of being called something you never were, none of that could be erased. Now outside, Elizabeth breathed the air of freedom, but not in the same way as before. The world had moved on without her, and she needed to learn to live in it again. But how do you rebuild a life that was destroyed by the very system that was supposed to protect it? How can you trust justice after being a victim of it? For many people, Elizabeth was just another case, another name on a list of overturned convictions. But for her friends, for every innocent person still behind bars, this story will never be just a case. What happened to Elizabeth was not an isolated mistake. It was the result of a flawed system where one person's word can be enough to destroy another, where justice is not always concerned with seeking the truth, but rather with finding someone to blame as quickly as possible. How many other people are still living this same nightmare? How many stories like this still need to be told for something to truly change? Elizabeth lost 17 years for a lie, but how? Many innocent people are still in prison right now, desperately waiting to be heard. Justice took almost 2 decades to right this wrong. But what about the lives that are still being destroyed now? Silence only favors those who want to hide the truth. This story cannot be forgotten. Like and share this video so that more people know the truth. The more people who know, the less chance this will happen again. And if you think this story was revolting, wait until you hear the next one. A case so unbelievable that even the investigators themselves were shocked. A truth buried for years, which when it came to light, changed everything. But that is a subject for the next video.